Hey, this is Dave with Taboo Customs. This video today we are going to be doing some rust repair in the rear axle control arm area of this 98 TJ behind us. Let's take a look at what we're dealing with. Alright, so the most common place that rusts out Jeep TJ's rear axle control arm area. And as you can see, this one here is pretty bad. You can see it's rusted out here. It's actually started to crack, and the crack started to travel up the frame, and nearly, could have potentially completely fractured right here, which would basically then push the frame up into the body and cause a whole lot of other issues. Interesting enough, on this frame, is this is really the only area that is really bad. The rear of the frame, not too bad. The front of the frame, not too bad. It's just kind of odd sometimes with these where they'll have one spot that just go completely to nothing. Now on the inside, we've got even more issues. Of course, it's rusted out, but the bigger issue we have here is that this control arm is not even connected to the frame anymore. This rust has taken it out here, and then because of all the stress of not being connected there in the bottom and probably in the front, it just fractured and broke off of this side. So we'll be going through and putting our repair kit on this Jeep. We'll actually be doing both sides of the frame rail, because the other side not nearly as bad, but is on its way there. So let's take a look at the kit. So this is our 534 TJ lower control arm rear axle repair kit. Includes an inside plate, outside plate for the frame. This is the bottom plate here. A couple of tie-in plates will actually go around the body mount. Also come with new lower control arm mounts that are made of all 1/4 inch. They'll come unassembled, so you will have to assemble and weld those. Also come with a new upper control arm mount that's all 7 gauge, heavier than the existing mount. And again, you will have to assemble this, and this one you'll have to be careful of because you assemble it based on the side it's going on. So there's a different assembly. They'll basically flip these two plates on the top and the bottom to put it on the other side. Now this kit does do one frame rail, so if like on our Jeep you're needing to do both frame rails, you'll need 2 kits, so make sure you keep that in mind. Kit will also come with some instructions, as well as some prints that will show you how to assemble, for instance, the driver side upper mount versus the passenger side. All right, so before we get into this, I'm going to cover a few things I probably should have covered before we even started talking about the kit and everything. And that is some of our, well, liability stuff that we, unfortunately, today's day and age have to cover. So one, this kit is meant for the worst normal situation. You may have more rust than this kit covers. If you do, you will have to figure out how to deal with that on your own. If the rust goes towards the Jeep, we do have some center section kits that overlap with this kit that would take care of this. However, in the future, let's say there's rust going up into the wheel well arch that goes past where this kit is, or there's not good metal past this kit, you will have to try to figure out something, add to this with some scrap metal or whatever you have to make sure that your frame is solid. You are the one responsible for making sure your frame is solid. We are just providing you a way to get there with these parts. So right now we don't provide a kit that has the upper wheel well arch, because at this point in time we haven't seen Jeeps that have gone past this kit. We've not seen any that are rusted that far, and honestly, if they are, the frame's probably completely scrap anyway. Cut it off, tube it, make a buggy, do something different, find a different frame, but good luck with that as well. So but perhaps in the future, there's people that want to, maybe we'll have one in the future. Right now we don't. So anyway, there's that. Also, you are welding to your frame, you're welding to something that if it fails could potentially cause safety issues. So make sure that you are an experienced welder. Going and doing this, you are going to be relying on your welds. People around you in the other vehicle is going to be relying on the strength of your welds potentially. So a experienced welder is definitely recommended. Also, 220 volt welder minimum is recommended. You're going to be welding 1/4 inch, 7 gauge, 10 gauge. Definitely, you know, the 7 gauge to 1/4 inch. You're going to want that 220 volt welder to make sure that you get good penetration. Also, doing this installation, you're going to be welding, you're going to be making a lot of sparks, you're going to be grinding. We recommend removing the fuel tank to remove that large bomb basically at the back of your Jeep that if you know, it were to catch fire, would obviously be a very, very bad day if you were to make it through that day. So essentially recommend removing the fuel tank as well. So with all the liability crap out of the way, let's talk about actually doing the repair. Okay, so doing a repair, we always start on the worst side of the Jeep. So if you don't have a worst side to pick from, just pick one side, go from there. Either side has its own easier and difficult things associated with it, so we'll try to cover those. We are starting on the driver's side because it is worst side. Upper control arm broken off. We definitely want to start on that side. Now, even with this upper control arm broken off, we still have both control arms connected on the passenger side. So essentially our 4-link is acting as a 3-link. Our pinion angle should still be fairly good. So we'll start over here, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get a measurement from this lower control arm mount to our front control arm mount, basically bolt to bolt, because we're going to want to try to match where this lower control arm mount is on this side. That is probably the biggest thing, to make sure that we do not have any kind of dog tracking, where your angle in the rear is cockeyed to your Jeep as it goes down the road. The rear end will basically want to go one way or another rather than stay straight. We definitely do not want that. The upper control arm mount, not as important, especially for that dog tracking. It mainly is going to control your pinion angle. However, if you had it way off, you know, an inch or so off, it is going to probably, you know, not be quite right. But being that it's not a steering axle, you don't have things like the steering geometry and the centering of the tires to worry about with the rear, so not as important. The main thing is getting the rear axle parallel to the front axle. Other ways that we'll also look at this is we have a laser tape measure that will actually go off the rear axle to the front axle. Would also recommend that just to double check to make sure that you are parallel to those both axles. Now, if you have it on a lift like this, you might have to be careful, because then the axle droop. One side of the front is drooped farther than the other. It might actually pull it back more. So a lot of things to be wary about. The other thing we have also done is also measured from one point onto the frame on one side to the rear axle, same point on the other side to the rear axle, just to make sure that we are square. You know, but sometimes frames aren't straight either, so especially ones that have been off-roaded, unfortunately, it can be a pain in the butt, especially with Jeeps sometimes. Anyway, next steps, we're going to start taking things off. On this side, we're going to need to remove the control arms from both the upper and lower. On the frame side, we'll loosen them on the axle side just so that we can get them out of the way. We will remove this rear sway bar linkage, and then we need to take all of our brake lines, fuel lines, wiring, get it all loose and get it out away from the frame so that we can start cutting off both the lower and the upper control arm mounts and start replacing those with the plates we have for the frame. So let's get started getting all that stuff loose. so disassembly, honestly, not too bad for what I expected. Pretty easy actually. There's only really 3 socket sizes you're going to need to take the suspension apart, and that's 21, 18, and 15 millimeter. The lowers both 21 on both sides. I believe this is either 15 or I think it's 15 actually for the upper control arm. The sway bar, one nut's 15, the others are 18, so pretty easy. The bolt that goes into the upper control arm mount for the that holds the brake line onto the upper control arm mount is a T40 Torx. That one's only kind of a pain in the butt because you do need a little distance because it's pretty close to the brake line. Hard to get in there with a real short bit. Anyway, so now we've got everything off. We pulled all the lines over. Make sure you're not dripping any gas out of the fuel line towards the back. Got everything pulled over, nice and clear for us to now go in and do our repair. The first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to remove the lower control arm and this upper control arm as well, what's left over of it. And then we're going to go ahead, we're going to cut out some of this area that is basically rusty. And what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to feel up in there and you'll feel a line, like for instance on this Jeep, that line is about right there. So basically everything above that line on the inside here is still pretty much full thickness. Everything below that is basically tapers off to nothing. And these Jeep frames will do that in a pretty short space. They'll go from basically full thickness to nothing, and I think a lot of that is it's just buildup of material, and however high that material builds up, it basically will rust out at that level. So we'll go in there, we'll cut some of that cancer out, and then we will come around and we'll take a look at the outside and how we're going to prep it, and then we can start laying out our pieces. Now let's take a look at real quick at the outside though before we start cutting the brackets off. Okay, so on the outside real quick, as far as prep, all we really need to do is pull this piece back. We kind of pulled it back enough because we're gonna have to weld up here really close. Now one thing you might notice on this Jeep is we've got some pieces of wood in here, and that's because if you look here, another Jeep, you know, common Jeep problem, this one has it where the subframe for the tub is actually rusted out. This tub is about probably a good 3/4 of an inch to an inch lower than it should be. Those pieces of wood right now is what this tub is sitting on. It's not sitting on the body mounts. That's one of the next projects here for this, and we'll be doing videos on that later. So if you want to see those, make sure you subscribe and you check those out. But we will be working on a kit for these and replacing those. So anyway, back to this. Really on the outside here, the only thing you have to do is get this up, get this out of the way so that we can go in here and again go and start cutting this out. Now what I would recommend here, so if I feel in there again about to this line here is where this tub has been rusted out, or excuse me, this frame on the inside is really thin, but you can see I think we have a crack that goes farther up, and we'll talk about that more when we get out here and we start prepping this and how we're going to deal with that crack. Okay, quick tip on removing these control arm brackets. Now, even though this is all rusted out up here, it's still fairly well connected down here to the bottom section. but on most things that are welded, if you can get it broken down to where you just got one weld on the side, a lot of times you can use your leverage to basically break that off, which is why you can see here I cut right here, because it's hard to get in there and actually cut this weld. I mean, we'll be able to get in there with the small die grinder and grind it down, but you can't really get in there and cut it. So I cut here so I can pry this part up, and it just pops off at that weld there just because of the leverage. And we may be able to do this on the inside. Yep. All right, so now we're left with this little piece back here. We'll do the same, and then we'll come in here, cut out all this bad, and grind off of these welds so we've got it smooth all around on our frame. Now with the control arm brackets for the most part off, we are going to take our inner and outer plates, put them up against the frame. We want the bottom of the plate to be flush with the bottom of the frame. This inner plate will butt up against this weld for the rear sway bar, and you can see the hole in the center of the frame where you get to the upper control arm mount bolt. You can kind of line that up to make sure in the right place. But with the plates up there, we're going to mark it out with a piece of chalk. On this inside plate, we're also going to mark across the bottom of the frame, in the front and in the rear. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the outside of the frame, do the same thing. So basically, once we have those marked out, we're going to have to take our grinder. We're going to want to clean up all around that area, because that's basically where we're going to, in the end, weld all these to the frame. At the same time, we're also going to clean up all these spots where there's some weld still hanging down here. We're also going to clean up some of these areas where, because we've gone in and cut some of the rust out, any of the areas where we kind of overcut, what we want to do is, you don't want those overcuts to basically start becoming a crack. So essentially here, where we've kind of cut past it, we'll clean that up. We'll weld it up as good as we can. We really want to make sure that we don't, start this frame cracking in any direction, especially any that are going vertically this way, because that's where we're mainly trying to retain the most strength. So once we do that, then we can start tacking our plates up. Okay, so we've done the initial cleanup. We've tacked a couple of areas where we welded up the crack on the outside as well. Ground out that smooth. Now we got to start putting our plates up here. And what we'll do is we'll start by, well, I'll actually start by putting, excuse me, the outside plate. And the reason why we're going to start with the outside plate is the outside plate, this section up here, the top, is larger than the inside plate, so we can actually clamp the outside plate without interfering with the inside plate. Basically, line up the plate at the bottom of the frame. Just roughly. And then we can come in, line up the inside plates, and clamp them both together. Now you can take this one that was up here and transfer it so it holds both plates. You want it tight, but not too tight that you can't adjust it. This next step is we're going to take a hammer and adjust the plates. Make sure okay, so we also want to make sure, of course, the holes are lined up as well. Once you get that, it may take a few more plates. I guess one thing I forgot to mention, you might have missed, we had to raise the body up some more. So that's why I had to bring a jack in here, jack this up some more. Put a block in here because, like I said before, the body's not really attached. So you usually will have a little bit of trouble getting in this area because there's a piece of the body that kind of hangs down below the frame. You can get to it. If you saw us cleaning up the frame, we were using a wire wheel, a grinder, a small die grinder, and then a straight die grinder. Pretty much have to use all those because the biggest, one of the most important things I forgot to mention is with the welding, the cleanliness is the biggest deal. You want to get all the rust, all the undercoating, paint, whatever off the frame, because that'll be the biggest thing to making sure you get good welds. So anyway, so we got our side plates in place. What we'll do is we'll get our bottom plate now. We'll roughly mark where we need to bend our bottom plate. What we're going to do is we're actually going to use the drum here on the Jeep and a hammer to basically start to make our gradual bend. And then once we get close enough, we can either push this up and tack it, or we can get a bigger C-clamp, clamp it down. We'll probably go ahead and get a C-clamp and go that route. One of the things you'll have to figure out which, where you line this up. Normally you want to make sure that the edge is lined up with this inside plate, but if you need to move it one way or another, you can, depending on if, for instance, if your frame is more rusted this way than that way, you might want to move it more that way. That is one of the harder welds to make, is that weld on the bottom of the frame, just because typically almost anywhere you go on the bottom of the frame, it's not in great shape, but this one's not too bad. Usually as long as you clean it up well and weld it correctly, it'll go pretty smooth. All right, so here's where we get to a point to where it really starts to get important. Now you don't have to get this bend perfect, because that's why we're going to use a couple of C-clamps. This one will bring this plate up to the bottom of the frame, and this one we can use to clamp in. Now, the first few tacks are really important, because you want to make sure that this bottom plate is straight all the way up the frame, because if not, if you get a little bit off and you're tacking this direction, you get up here and this bottom plate can get off of these side plates a little bit, and you don't want that. And what we're going to do now is we're going to basically start here, put a couple of tacks here, we'll move back, move our clamp, tighten this up a little bit. So we're basically using this clamp to bring it all the way up, using, this clamp to bring these two plates in, and then we'll start putting tacks on the outside here. And you want to make sure you get enough tacks on there that it will stay where you want it as you go through and you do all of your tacking, and then also when we pull it off to start welding it. Then as we of course work our way up, we'll just work our way up all the way around this bend. We might have a little bit of trouble with this one since we added this block in here. Normally that block's not there, so we'll have to see, maybe we'll just have to slide that block around or work around it somehow. So all right, let's get to welding. Now you can see how we've gone, and we've pretty much tacked it every inch or so. Taking the hammer, closing up any large gaps that you might have. You don't want any gaps. That would be your enemy in this, but you do want to make sure you do get those closed up. You can see as we had to make the bend, the tacks got closer and closer. Using and just get closer to the end. It's easier to use a hammer to kind of close that up, and then use the clamp to make sure you get it up tight. So now what we'll do is we will pull this off of the frame and we will weld it up on a table. So what we'll do with it off of the Jeep and on the table is we will weld the inside first, and we'll go ahead and we'll weld the outside. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to go in there, clean out all of your spatter. Then we can go ahead, flip it over, weld the outside. Then you have the option, if you wanted to potentially grind this smooth on the outside. It wouldn't be such a big deal since you welded the inside and you welded the outside. You'll have that reinforcement on the inside. But typically if you don't need to grind it, I wouldn't. Where we put our lower control arm mount, and maybe somewhere also for our upper control arm mount, we will do a little bit of grinding just to make sure it sits flat and flush against the frame. We've got our frame section welded up. One thing I didn't mention before is that we do recommend that you prime the inside of these frame sections before you reinstall them. You do want to prevent as much rust as possible. We use a 3M weld through primer. What we have found that works best. It's a zinc based primer. Can sort of weld through it. You don't want it on the top edges or the edges you're going to weld, but you can put it on the inside pretty easily, and it works pretty well, but it is a little pricey. We will put a link to it in the description if you're interested in it. So with this, just slide it right back on. It may have towed in a bit whenever you're welding it, so you might have to pry it out some. Especially if you hit the edge of where you've cut. Now, probably the easiest way to make sure you got it all the way up before you start welding is take both of your large C-clamps. You go ahead and clamp it in there. Now, we didn't cover one thing earlier, and that is there are a couple of slots in this, and that is mainly for drainage. So we've got one back here to allow your frame to drain. You've got a couple of options there. You could go ahead and cut this out before you put this up in here, or with this here you could use it as sort of a template and just drill a hole there. Main goal is just to make sure that all that gunk that was in there before that was causing the frame to rust has a way to get out. For some reason with these TJ frames, they put a lot of holes in the side and no holes in the bottom, so that's part of the issue. Is the frames just fill up with stuff and they rust out. Okay, so before we start welding, let's talk about it a little bit more. This is now the time to go and check and make sure that you have adequate area cleaned for all your welds, because the next step is going to be just solid welding as much as you can of here. Now, I would recommend you don't need to weld to this body mount. We actually have pieces that will go around it, but I do recommend welding up here above it. You can try welding down in there if you would like. But you definitely want to be checking, because for instance back here we did not clean this enough. We cleaned a little bit lower, didn't get up in here, so we're actually gonna have to pull this back off and clean that up before we start welding. But just make sure you do double check everything, because the amount of time you spend cleaning will directly affect the quality of results you get. A couple more tips before we actually get to welding. Double check any of your gaps before you weld them. What we're going to do is we're going to pick some of the tightest areas. We're going to put some welds there first so we can remove our C-clamps, so that we can use those to close up any gaps that we might have. You don't want any gaps if at all possible. When you get down to some areas like here on the end where it's not boxed in, you basically got an edge to the frame, you can use your hammer to tighten that up. And what you can do is, as you weld this down here, you're going to heat up all that material. It's going to be much easier to hammer if it is hot, so you can kind of weld it, hammer it, keep going as you go along there. Close up those gaps, make it pretty tight, try to make it look all good. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get it welded in. Alright, so taking a look real quick at the finished, well, somewhat finished welding here. Now in this area here, we're going to put some fish mouth plates, so we're going to have to do a little cleanup around those on the inside. You know, in general, it went pretty well. Not a whole lot of issues. Now, there's a lot of things to keep in mind when you're doing this, and I'm going to tell you that trying to film it while you're doing it is a real pain in the butt. The biggest thing to probably watch out for, this thing's catching on fire. We had our light stuck up there in the skid plate, and spatter and everything can bounce down the skid plate. A little bit of oil there, and the light actually caught fire. A lot of times here on the top of the frame you'll have the paint or whatnot catch fire up there, so you have to be careful of that. You also have to be careful of the tub, so just make sure that you're stopping every few seconds and you don't have something you can't recover from while you're welding. So what we're going to need to do now is we do have a couple of little spots we need to touch up. I see with weld that we missed a little spot there on the outside. Then we're going to come in, we're going to go ahead and put these small fish mouth plates in on the body mount. All right, so the next step is to install the little plates that we were talking about that will go around the body mount. Those plates go around the body mount just like that, pushed all the way up. We'll weld them solid all the way around. Now you're probably going to have to clean up the body mount with some spatter or anything that came off of your welding for these plates. You may also want to take a die grinder or something and hit it. Make sure you get a good weld to your body mount. But this is basically to tie in this piece to this piece all the way up here to the front, so we have a more solid piece as we flow through this. The alternative would be obviously cutting off the body mount and trying to weld it on. In lieu of that, we do these to make sure we have good strength across those plates. So we're going to clean it up a little bit more, and then we'll get to welding those in. So next step, we can start making our control arm mounts. Now the bottom mount, pretty easy. Both driver and passenger side, it's the same mount, so you don't have to worry too much about how you assemble it. We do provide some instructions. There are some things that you're going to need to pay attention to. One is the direction of this bottom plate. This large U will go towards the control arm, and that's for control arm clearance. The other big things is making sure that your side plates here are square, which we can check them to the table, and then you can use a C-clamp and the back plate and the bottom plate to actually set the width. Now make sure that these side plates to the bottom plate are pretty tight as far as the tab and slot, and that's to make sure that we don't have issues with hole alignment across. And you can check that by looking at the front of the plate and make sure both of these side plates are flush with this front plate before you start welding it. Once you get that done, you can go ahead, tack it up, make sure it doesn't move while you're welding it. Make sure you get enough tacks on there, it's not going to move. Then go ahead and pretty much you want to weld it solid as much as you can on this inside, the side plate to the bottom, down across the back here. But you don't necessarily want to weld the bottom section here, because we're going to have to stick this up against the frame and weld it, but you can weld this slot right here to make sure you get good penetration on the outside here too, from the side plates to the bottom plate. So we'll get to that in a second. First, let's take a look at the upper control arm mount though, because that one is dependent on the side. Now, this is the driver's side mount that we took off, and it is easy. If you have the mount that you're going to build, you can put it right in front of you. We've got the pieces for our new mount. This is the bottom piece. This is the piece that's basically emulating this outside. Got it backwards already. So we can put that piece there. Now these are the two pieces that are important, because if you build this wrong, you won't be able to make it work. This larger piece is going to be the top piece. And now this piece is also tabbed and slotted so that you can put it into place and And then this piece here is the bottom piece. Put it into place, and now we've got something that we can start to work with. And if we had our C-clamp already ready, that would have been awesome, but we didn't. So anyway, we'll take our C-clamp, and pull it there in place. Now, for the most part, it will set itself once you start to get it assembled. You're going to want to check and make sure that it is square as much as possible. You'll have to check these upper and lower plates. They can move back and forth, so you want them in a place so that you can get good welds on each end. You don't want it too far to one side or the other, so just kind of even it up. Same thing with the bottom plate, except you're really just worried about this back plate. Once you have it pretty much set to there, it's square, you can start tacking it up and welding it and making sure that everything is solid. Now again, you can weld as much as you can, but you don't want to weld too much. Well, you don't want to weld at all. Right here in this area, you can weld down the inside here, but this is going to have to sit up flush against the frame, so you don't want weld on that surface. All right, let's get to welding. So there we have it with the lower control arm, and definitely on the lower you want to get in down in here as far as you can, get it solid welded. Again, don't weld anything on the bottom. I will actually probably go and weld these sides, I forgot about that. The upper control arm, we welded all around the outside of it. Flip it over, welded down inside of it. Don't necessarily need to try to get down in here. It's going to be really hard to get in there. We're going to take and weld this all to the frame so it'll be solidly mounted and stronger than the original. Fix my issue with this one. So now we just clean them up. We can start mounting them to the frame. All right, so it's time to start putting on our lower control arm mount. Now, if you've been following our instructions that come with the kit, you will have some measurement off of the frame to where this original lower control arm bolt was. Now, for us, we recommend coming off the front control arm mount, and typically it's about 59 inches. Sometimes it will vary up to 1/4 of an inch based on, I guess, where the frame was and how it was built. But what we are trying to do is basically put this bolt back in the exact same place as it was before, so that we retain the same geometry. So what we've done is we've done our measurement. We've put a line up here on the frame. We've gone ahead and put our control arm mount in here. And then what we've done is we've used a ratchet strap, because typically whenever you take off both these control arm mounts, the axle will start to move towards the rear. So we took a ratchet strap, pulled the axle back forward until we got to the point, still warm, got to the point to where we're able to line this bolt up directly with that mark. Now, when we push up this control arm mount to the bottom of the frame, and one, you're going to want to make sure you go and grind off any excess weld that might be on the bottom of the frame. Same thing on the top of the mount. It's going to be at an angle. It's not going to be straight with the frame. It's going to be angled out towards the rear. What we're going to do is we're going to pull this out so this front corner here is basically flush with the frame. That's going to give you a pretty good shelf up here to be able to actually put some decent fillet welds from this mount onto the frame. And what we're going to do then is once we get this in place, we're going to go ahead, remove the lower control arm again from the mount, go in here and solid weld as much as we can. Solid weld that large U up to the bottom of the frame. And then on the outside here, we're actually going to probably put 3 welds. We're going to do a 3-pass weld on the outside. Then we're going to do the same thing on the inside, because you'll have the same sort of location to do a pretty good fillet weld to the frame. So let's get to that. All right, so the biggest thing with this, again, you're going to need to do as many passes as it takes to really tie in this outer plate to the frame itself. I mean, this outer plate is tied to the bottom plate. We're welding it in there, so it is pretty solid, but overkill is what you want for this. So after you get this done, we'll go in, we'll clean that up. What we're going to do is we're going to wait a little while because we want this to cool down. We'll reconnect our lower control arm to it, and then we can start positioning our inside control arm mount. Now to get the upper control arm mount into place, since the lower upper control arm mount was broken off whenever we started this, we weren't able to get good measurements. Normally we'd get a measurement, try to emulate some of those measurements, but being we have the both control arms connected on the other side, the axle is pretty much where it is going to be. I don't want to try to pull it into a bind and put it in a place where it doesn't want to go. So the main thing that we're going to look at then is we're going to look at making sure we get this bolt at the correct height. To do that, we basically looked and lined it up with the hole on the inside, and also being that we've done a lot of these, we know that whenever we get this into place, this front bottom corner of the upper control arm mount will just barely hang off of the frame and kind of stick out. So we put it up there, we've got it lined up. We'll take the back and we'll actually lower it down all the way till it comes down to the lower control arm mount. That's so that we can get up here and get a pretty good weld on the top of this upper control arm mount to really make sure that it's solid. The angle that is at is not really massively important compared to making sure that this bolt is basically in roughly the correct orientation, correct position vertically. All right, let's go ahead and burn it in. So here we have the upper control arm in place, and one last look at the kit. This will be the inside before we go and wire wheel it, clean it up, and get a good coat of prime and paint onto it. Now, as for the passenger side is, to a degree, a little bit easier, maybe a little bit harder. The biggest issue, the biggest difference on the passenger side is removing the exhaust, because the exhaust is typically very much in the way. So depending on how hard your exhaust is to come apart, that would probably depend on, or change how difficult it is to get this kit installed. But essentially that is the only difference from the driver side to the passenger side, is just the amount of stuff you have to deal with. Obviously you don't have to deal with the fuel lines and brake line and all that good stuff, so that's a little bit easier, but you do have to deal with the exhaust. So thanks for watching. That'll do it for this rust repair video. Hopefully it answered most of your questions. If you do have other questions, we do have some other videos on this same kit out there. You can check those out, or you can leave a comment here or contact us on our website, taboocustoms.com. That's where you'll also find our rust repair kits and skid plates and a lot of other things that we have available for purchase. So be sure to check that out. Thanks for watching. As always, a like or subscribe is greatly appreciated.